modern physics, you have at least two major ways of arguing that we live in a multiverse, not just one universe, but many different universes branching off of each other. And they're designed to answer or resolve two separate problems. The first one is the problem or the question of what's called fine-tuning. And this is the fact that many of the constants that we observe in physics, right, are minutely calibrated. They're within very, very small ranges of the possible values that could support conscious life. Things like the configuration of mass and energy at the beginning of the universe, and the charges between certain particles, certain subatomic particles, right? The force of attraction. These things are exactly what they need to be in order for life to exist. And it turns out that they don't have to be that way, so far as we can tell. There's no philosophical reason why they have to be this way. One way of answering that question that does not invoke God, right? Because scientists are loath to invoke God as an explanation for things, right? So if it's not God, if it's not what Fred Hoyle, the astrophysicist, called a super intellect that has monkeyed with the universe, maybe it's just that there's lots of different universes, and this just happens to be the one where the conditions are right for life. And this is where you get what is called the string inflationary landscape model, or string inflationary cosmology. And the idea here is, again, speaking very generally, right, string theory describes the universe as minutely small vibrating strings, which vibrate to produce the laws of physics. Perhaps those configurations of strings decay, and then as the universe expands, there develop new pockets where the configuration of strings is different, and the laws of physics are different, and these constants would therefore be different, and so would the initial conditions of the universe, right? So the problem with this is that we have no evidence for it, except that there are many different solutions to the equations of string theory. So the idea is here, well, maybe all of those equations describe different universes, and ours is the one that happens to apply to, one set of equations, but all these other sets of equations describe other universes. But there's no experiment that observes, right, these other bubbles of the string theory space, right, bubbling up in these other parts of the universe making machine. It also doesn't answer the God question, because somebody would have had to make the string inflationary landscape anyway, but that's sort of a separate point too. This is a very fanciful idea, and most people that encounter it will acknowledge that, like, you have to invent a bunch of stuff or postulate a bunch of things that not only have we never seen, we never could see. They could never be observed, right? So that's one sort of multiverse model. The other one is designed to resolve exactly the ambiguity that I was just talking about in terms of our perception of the world. That when you look away from things, you have no idea, no way of knowing, right, what things are like, because things are only like anything to a conscious mind, right? And so the fact that, for instance, when you pass photons, that is the quanta of light, the particles of light, through a half-silvered mirror, half of them bounce off one way, half of them pass through, right? And it turns out, in fact, that they seem to behave in ways that suggest they actually bounce. They both bounce and pass through until they are observed, right? You can do various experiments where you pass light through a half-silver mirror, and it looks like they take both of the possible paths until you observe them, and then 50% take one, 50% take the other, so on and so forth. How can this possibly be? How can we wrap our heads around this without giving some role to consciousness? Because a theist is actually quite comfortable saying, well, consciousness has a role, right, in the construction of reality. That's why God makes man last and invites him to give names to the animals, right? We can see with our mind, with our consciousness, and we therefore give this finalizing cap to reality. So reality has an existence outside of us, but it's sort of amorphous or indescribable or beyond, the categories of our mind before we observe it. Then when we observe it, we bring this kind of finalizing order to it. And that's why Barfield talks about the organizing feature of consciousness, not just as like language that we use, but the things that the language represents, right? The language, the words that we use represent these concepts in our mind, and the concepts themselves are sort of structured by the way our mind itself works. We can't even help it. We just look at things and they resolve, right? Another example of this is like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? That you can't, you can measure the velocity of something, but then you can't know its location. You can measure its location, but then you can't know its momentum, and so on and so forth, right? So when we perform these observations, we seem to actually have an effect upon things And that effect is exactly the effect that you would predict if you were a Barfieldian and a theist, which is to say it's the effect of finally consummating an otherwise indeterminate reality.